New York in the crack years felt like a chessboard wired with traps. Corners became kingdoms. Fear was currency, and one name could quiet a whole block. He didn't just hustle, he commanded, and a single word from a cage could shake the streets. Cops felt it, crews saluted it, courts had to face it. This isn't rumor or legend. It's a hard story about power, pride, and a message sent so loud the city still hears it. No rumors, no fairy tales, just a hard climb from street whispers to a verdict that echoed. If you think you know power, you don't know this story yet. Join us as we follow the ranks, decode the rules, and pull back the curtain on a reign that tried to put a whole city on ice. By the mid-'80s, crack slid onto New York streets and everything tilted. Young, hungry crews posted up on corners, chasing turf and fast money. Law enforcement said the heat was worst uptown, north of 96th Street, where the smoke brought a new kind of war. The goal wasn't only to sell, it was to scare. Crews pushed rivals off blocks, kept witnesses quiet, and made regular folks think twice before dialing the cops. The city felt wired tight, like every hallway, stoop, and bodega line could turn into a setup. The numbers told the story. Investigators tied as many as 523 slayings in 5 years to these drug crews in Upper Manhattan. That's roughly 1 out of every 3 killings since 1983 in that slice of the city. It wasn't random spray for no reason. It was strategy. Crews fought for control, settled money beefs, and handled internal drama the hard way. Each body was a message. This is our block, our paper, our rules. Cops said more than a dozen named crews drove most of the bloodshed. They hid in daylight for maximum fear, crowds watching, no mask on the threat, semi-auto pistols close to the head, clean up the problem and keep the corner. They called it the intimidation factor, and it worked. People learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. Most hits came from turf beefs or money disputes, but the chaos bled. Passers-by got caught when bullets chased targets down packed streets. Here's the twist most folks miss. Even in the 80s, violence stayed clustered in the city's poorest pockets, and usually between people who knew each other. Domestic beefs have always driven many homicides. The hype of random danger played loud, sure, and it opened the door for heavy police tactics. But randomness wasn't the main story. If you weren't tied to the life or trapped in a violent home, the risk was lower than the headlines made it sound. Time fogs the cause and effect. People act like the city's breakdown caused the crime wave, but a lot of the slide, the shaky economy, budget pain, weak services, hit back in the mid-'70s. Suburban white flight didn't follow the wave. It helped set the stage for it. Then when things cooled in the 90s, folks praised extreme measures like they were magic. The truth is messier, and the streets remember. As the smoke thickened citywide, another storm was building in Queens. Different blocks, same code, power, silence, control. And when one boss decided to send a message that the whole city would hear, the war got a new face. Howard "Pappy" Mason came up in New York with a clockwork grind and a reputation that traveled faster than he did. Born September 8, 1959, he came out of Crown Heights, Brooklyn, but sharpened his edge in Queens in the years when the crack era redrew the city's map. He wasn't just another corner man, he was a mover who treated blocks like assets and people like levers. The name Pappy sat at the intersection of power and fear. Every time it got said, someone checked who else might be listening. Inside that world walked Howard "Pappy" Mason, a sturdily built Rasta with long dreads and gold teeth, one carved with a shamrock. He started under Fat Cat as security at the game room for $1,000 a week, showed up on time, and got bumped to a spot by the 40s projects, then to a busier patch across from a public school dot. By the early to mid-1980s, he had plugged into the organization run by Lorenzo "Fat Cat" Nichols in South Jamaica, Queens, a machine that called itself the Bebos and proved it with routine, structure, and profit. He wasn't a slick seller. Street red was simple. Nichols was cunning and ruthless. Mason was stupid and brutal. Even Fat Cat's people thought Pappy was too wild, too quick to handle problems with a pistol instead of his head. This wasn't small sales on a quiet stoop. The Bebos were turning roughly $200,000 a month and approximately $20 million a year, which meant cash to pay soldiers, cash to smooth logistics, and cash to close the mouths that needed closing. Big Mac's Deli became a nerve center. Calls taken, orders set, drops arranged, and Fat Cat's tight circle ran the playbook, while Mason, never a side character, enforced the map and curated silence. He posted prices, kept lines clean, and made examples of anyone who shook the table. Viola, Fat Cat's sister, worked for Pappy, bagging crack, and was his lover. She smoked heavy, stole heavy, and dragged chaos with her. Sometimes Fat Cat had to square her debts, handing Pappy a free kilo when she burned $10,000 worth of product. Claudia Mason, Pappy's mother, called herself Mrs. Bebo and kept a trunk full of guns. Viola said it straight on a wire. He got it honest. This mix of blood, hustle, and heat would later pull the feds into every living room tied to both men. The block, his base in and around the 40 projects, wasn't a nickname so much as a stamp, and the stamp meant consequences. Cross him, and you got removed from the line. Creep toward his spot, and you disappeared from the conversation. The South Jamaica crack wars meant open markets, fast money, and faster retaliation. In that weather, Mason's presence changed the temperature in lobbies and stairwells. Crack flipped the game. With a pan, vials, and baking soda, crews could pop up fast. Pappy went all in and pushed the Bebos deep into retail. Fat Cat preferred wholesale but bowed to demand. Meanwhile, Pappy's rep got darker. Stories spread of him beating women, hanging a girlfriend by the legs out of a moving car, and finishing an interrogation others started with curling irons and a body dumped. Inside Queens, the Bebos became a name that made lobbies go quiet. People learned the protocol. Don't be loud, don't be curious, and don't be seen talking to uniforms. The crown Nichols wore depended on lieutenants who could keep the edges tight, and Mason proved he could both hold the line and push it when orders came down. Even when the cuffs closed on him for firearms charges and the bars locked, his voice stayed out there on the wind. Visits, phone calls, loyalty, and the same rules still reach corners that had learned to listen. Power like that doesn't sit quietly. It moves by influence until someone forces it to stop. Ask around in those years, and people will tell you the same vibe. When Pappy was out, the block went quiet. He was the kind of enforcer who didn't have to speak twice. Reputation did the work before the first phone call. That fear held the corners tighter than any chain or lock. It also set the stage for a decision that crossed every line and made his name headline history. Early 1988, a judge cut Pappy loose while he waited on the Rooney retrial. On the street, Officer Robert Kish told him to ditch a beer. When Kish grabbed his hair, Pappy felt dissed in front of the set. Days later, he got slammed back into jail on the Derringer case. From the Brooklyn House of Detention, word moved. A cop had to die to answer the disrespect. A patch of South Jamaica turned into the fuse for a message that was designed to be louder than bullets. On 107th Avenue and Inwood Street sat the home of a Guyanese immigrant named Arjun, a man who kept calling the police about the crew selling on his doorstep. The house had already been firebombed twice. Threats became routine. Windows were boarded. Neighbors kept their heads down. It was the kind of block where silence was currency, and Arjun kept spending against the grain. On the night the fuse ran out, the NYPD posted a guard. The assignment fell to Officer Edward Byrne, born February 21, 1966, a rookie 5 days past his 22nd birthday who had followed his father into the department. He had come on the job July 15, 1986, worked transit first, then went to the 103rd Precinct in Jamaica. The post sounded simple. Park outside the witness's house after midnight, watch for movement, and call it in if anything popped. Simple doesn't mean safe. It meant one marked unit, one uniformed cop, and a front row seat to the tension that had already lit 2 fires. Mason sat in custody on his gun case, while his crew kept breathing on the street, and from that cell the word traveled. The order, as witnesses later told it, was to make an example. He put up $8,000 as a bounty, a number that buys fast work when reputations are at stake. If the goal was to tell the neighborhood and the NYPD who belonged to whom, then a shield in a parked RMP would serve as the billboard. In the early morning hours of February 26, 1988, around 3:30 a.m., a car rolled up beside Byrne's vehicle. 2 men stepped out while 2 more acted as lookouts. One tapped the passenger window, a casual knock to pull attention. The other slid to the driver's side and brought up a .38, 5 shots at close range to the head. No robbery, no argument, no confusion, just an execution on a quiet block that had already been warned by smoke and boarded windows. The first responding officers found Byrne upright behind the wheel. A folded copy of the Daily News lay on the seat beside a small AM/FM radio. They tried to raise him, got silence, and ran him to the hospital. NYPD officer Tony Keller put words to what everyone already understood. It was an execution, and the label stuck because it fit. The choice of target mattered too. The crew circled more than once, decided against killing a female officer, decided against a black officer, then chose Byrne, a blue-eyed Irish cop, to stand as a symbol for the whole department. The selection was deliberate because the message was deliberate. If a marked unit at a guard post could be dropped on a watched street, then anyone could be hit. Witnesses, rivals, and cops. Before sunrise, the story had outrun the neighborhood. Phones lit up. The press ran hot. President Ronald Reagan called the Byrne family. Then Vice President George W. Bush carried Byrne's badge during the 1988 campaign. The badge became a prop with weight to it. It wasn't just metal anymore. It was a talking point about order, punishment, and what government owed to neighborhoods that had been told to sit down and shut up. Inside the NYPD, the killing detonated like a drill bit through brick. Commissioner Raymond Kelly would later call it a ruthless act that captured the city's attention like few others. And the colleagues who wore the same patch at the 103rd Precinct felt that description as much as they heard it. This was not a back alley beef in the hidden dark. This was a uniform in a marked car, 5 to the head, at a witness house that had already been twice firebombed. A killing built to echo into roll call rooms, into radio chatter, into living rooms where families set an extra place for fear. In the larger city, the numbers built pressure. New York would log 1,896 murders that year, many tied to drug disputes and street hustles. And Burns' death cut through the noise because it wrapped up the era in a single point: open air sales, targeted terror, and crews flexing to prove they could bruise the badge. The feds took point. They tapped Viola's phone, Fat Cat's less than a month after the hit. She was a phone addict, running up to 100 calls a day, and the tap gave prosecutors more than the murder picture. On August 11, 1988, Operation Horse Collar unsealed, and 400 agents swept the block and beyond. New York moved fast on the 4 gunmen. In 1989, they got slammed in state court with the max, 25 years to life. The shooters were off the street, but heat doesn't drop when the central question sits unanswered. And the question, the one both the tabloids and the precincts asked, was who had called the shot. Neighborhood rumor and federal suspicion pointed to the same name. A month after the murder, on a separate firearms case, Mason caught 7 years, a hole that kept him inside while the feds built something bigger. State court had punished the hands that held the gun. The federal plan was to find the head that sent them. Agents leaned into enterprise mode. The angle was heavy but simple. Showed that the Bebos ran much of the South Jamaica crack trade in the mid to late 80s. Proved that control was welded to fear and framed retaliation as policy. Then bolt the murder onto that machine with a jailhouse order designed to freeze witnesses and thrill the set. The file fattened. Witness statements, enterprise charts, wiretap logs, buried in thousands of FBI tapes, sat a thin slice the government pulled and held up. Mason asking if they, the shooters, had arrived yet after the shooting. It was fuzzy and would be contested, but it matched what the shooters later said and sounded like a boss checking on the work. On August 11, 1988, Mason and others got picked up on a federal narcotics conspiracy case. Inside, he drew heat, stabbings with a homemade shank, a cell fire over a phone beef, and got shifted from MCC to Otisville and back. Then came the superseding indictment on August 15, 1989. It carried the heavy count that changed the lane, accusing him of ordering Officer Burns' murder. This was no longer only dope and RICO. This was the boss move the feds wanted the jury to see. The chessboard was ready, and the government was done playing just defense. Around that time, jail staff clocked a sudden change and sent Mason to MCC psychologist Dr. Perry Hess. Hess noted paranoid delusions, agitation, violent outbursts, selective mutism, social withdrawal, weight loss, and poor hygiene. He recommended a forensic facility. On September 15, 1989, Mason hit the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. Clinical psychologist Dr. Richard D'Andrea got one sit-down and then a run of brief door checks, about a dozen to 15, and filed a report on October 23, 1989. His red was tight. Mason knew the charges. His refusal to cooperate was volitional, and he was competent to stand trial. The clock on trial started ticking again, and that meant the room would soon be drawn and the jury seated. Late October 1989, back at the MCC, Pappy met with his court-appointed lawyer, Harry Batchelder, with Mason's mother present. The talk was about a potential plea that might help his mother, but the meat went bad. Batchelder said Mason stared vacant, accused him of lying about co-defendants flipping, and didn't grasp how his choices could hit his mother's sentence. On November 7, 1989, Mason stood before Judge Edward R. Corman and snapped, "It's your lawyer. It ain't my lawyer." He asked, "What is it I'm charged with?" The judge read the indictment out count by count. Mason asked what racketeering meant, pushed back about fresh federal charges after state time, and then dropped the cold line, "If you're going to give me life, you're going to give me life anyway." Jury selection opened November 27, 1989. Batchelder asked for a competency hearing, pointing to Mason's statements. The judge noted D'Andrea's competency finding and how Mason had seemed rational in court, but still called D'Andrea in to testify. The jury got picked with Pappy in the room. The next morning, Mason refused to attend. Judge Corman went straight to the cell and laid it out. "The trial will go on. You can help your lawyer, suggest cross questions, and I'll recess to let you confer." Mason said he couldn't get a fair trial and chose to stay in the cell. The issue stopped being paperwork and turned into will. His will to sit out versus the court's duty to move. The audio feed to the holding cell wasn't ready, so the jury got sworn and the government began witnesses without him. On November 29th, Mason attended in the morning while detectives testified about the burn case. Mid-testimony, he stood up, the court paused, and he asked to go back to the cell. The judge repeated the same push. Help your counsel. The standard is beyond a reasonable doubt. You can tip the scale. But Pappy wanted out. He stayed for that day, then locked back into absence. The court wasn't letting the case freeze. The show was going to run. By December 4th, a camera was piped into Mason's holding cell so he could see live proceedings, though glitches meant he missed summations and one day of evidence. The trial rolled on, with audio, with video, with gaps, and with a defendant who chose distance as a statement. The state had stepped back earlier for a reason. New York's evidence rules would have made using some co-defendant testimony harder, so federal court became the stage where the enterprise and the murder could be told as a single move, not two separate stories. Operation Horse Collar named 37 people from both trees: Claudia Mason, Brian Glaze Gibbs, Joseph Mike Bones Rogers, Joanne Nichols, Carolyn Tyson, and 3 of Fat Cat's nieces among them. Viola went from spitting on a TV mic to testifying, translating Pappy's Pig Latin on tape, Stidi Zay Stree Di Dong, Stay Strong, and then slid into witness protection. Fat Cat cut a plea in September 1989 to save his mother from 20 years. As he told Viola on his 30th birthday, "I'd cop out if it's to save my mama." The jury watched a picture built from structure and fear, not just bullets and bodies. The enterprise story was laid like railroad tracks, so a jury could write it straight. It wasn't just motive, it was model. The government said the hit was a boss move to protect position and Project Fear. Drugs and RICO were the skeleton, and Burns' murder was the heart pumping the message. Inside the U.S. Attorney's office, a young prosecutor, Leslie Caldwell, got handed the file after a senior was pulled off. A judge told her she was too green. She set a quiet goal: to do the case and not panic. Laced up for morning runs to keep the pressure down. Looked at the skyline to clear her head, then walked into court and built an opening the jury could follow without getting lost. Each strategy read simple on paper and lived complicated in the room. Tell the whole story once so the count sticks. On December 11th, 1989, after 13 hours across 3 days, the jury came back. Guilty on all 11 drug conspiracy counts. Guilty on the allegation that Mason ordered Officer Edward Burns murdered to secure his position. The courtroom felt the gasp when the last count landed. Burns' parents had been there from day one. They left quiet, escorted by off-duty officers. In the garage, Burns' father put his head on a car door and wept. A U.S. Marshal said of Mason's face, he showed no emotion. He didn't even blink. The 4 shooters had already met their fate. Now the boss stepped into a place with no corners to hold and a clock that never ticks. The machine that used fear met a larger machine that stamped permanent. After the verdict, Mason's behavior fell off a cliff. He refused to shower, change, or clean his cell. He broke a window when denied cosmetics, threatened a correction officer, and went further off. The court brought in Dr. Daniel Schwartz, a forensic psychiatrist. On May 23, 1990, Schwartz said Mason was overwhelmed by rage and paranoid beliefs, had regressed and ranted about revenge, and couldn't face sentencing. When Judge Corman pressed about trial time competency, Schwartz first leaned toward deferring to earlier evaluations, and later wrote that Mason had been competent at trial, though not fit for sentencing at that moment. The mind state became the new battlefield, with experts about to step to the line. Mason went back to Springfield in June 1990. Dr. Michael Morrison evaluated him through July. Mason refused tests again, but Morrison still saw the shape: antisocial personality, no major mental illness, and non-cooperation by choice. In November 1990, Judge Corman saw Mason in court and heard a different level of ranting, so he ordered another check. When they brought Pappy into court for a sanity hearing, he started yelling, "You, cracker," then poured a wild monologue across the room. Threats, claims of power, "I mark her" about Leslie Caldwell, and lines like "I am the motherfucking mayor of motherfucking Brooklyn." He demanded Vernon Mason called the judge a Klansman if he talked wrong, and then went silent. At Mason's request, Dr. Abraham Halpern met him in January 1991, diagnosed bipolar manic, and called him incompetent for sentencing and incompetent at the time of trial. One expert now split the pack. The court started drilling the difference between a true break and a performative wall, between illness and calculation. By March 1992, Dr. John Phelan from Springfield weighed in after a long observation stretch from May 1991 to January 1992. He rejected the bipolar label, said antisocial fit better, and suggested any past explosive behavior might have been a brief reactive psychosis, not a major disorder. He read the on and off irrational acts as a tell for malingering more than madness. The files were now stacked with conflicting reads, one calling psychotic disorders, another calling performance and choice. The court needed a balanced voice that could walk the line between them without collapsing to one side. In April 1992, the court reappointed Dr. Naomi Goldstein. She interviewed Mason on September 11, 1992, and he was polite, cooperative, and clear that he knew he'd been convicted for ordering Burns' murder, though he denied guilt. He could explain the judge, the jury, the lawyer roles, and talk about his attorneys. Goldstein diagnosed antisocial personality with probable atypical psychosis, not active, and said he wasn't clearly psychotic in 1989, though she couldn't rule out psychosis around the conviction shock. She believed his paranoia may have reached delusional intensity at points, and that isolation may have led to neglect, but her bottom line matched the enterprise picture. Amid pride and power fixation, he made a conscious decision to resist a lost cause. She found him competent at trial and competent now to be sentenced. On January 7, 1994, after years of reports and hearings, the district court ruled that Mason had been competent to stand trial in 1989 and was competent to be sentenced. Judge Corman leaned on his own observations, the D'Andrea and Springfield reads, Phelan's skepticism about bipolar, and Goldstein's balanced diagnosis. He noted Mason's courtroom questions, asking what racketeering meant, tracking counts, debating access to the law library, as signs of understanding. When Mason interrupted with rambling claims of innocence, his lawyer put on the record that Mason had dropped to all fours, head near the floor, then stood again. The judge still read it as calculated fakery. Life without parole went on the sheet. The door clicked like steel that doesn't slide back. Mason took it to the Second Circuit with 4 arguments. First, he said the district judge wrongly put the burden on him to prove incompetence. Second, he said the court was wrong that he was competent in 1989 and in 1994. Third, he said the court let him waive his right to attend before finding him competent to make that waiver. Fourth, he said the trial ran without him, without a knowing voluntary waiver on the record. The file that went upstairs was heavy. Transcripts, expert reports, the judge's colloquies, the cell audio and video, and a verdict that had turned the city's anger into federal time. The panel laid out the Dusky standard in simple terms. You must have enough present ability to consult with your lawyer with a reasonable degree of rational understanding, and you must have a rationale as well as factual understanding of the proceedings. They noted federal law uses a preponderance standard. On who carries the burden, the court declined to decide because the district judge had clarified that his ruling didn't depend on burden at all. The evidence wasn't a tie. On trial time competency, the judges leaned on what the district court saw and what multiple doctors said: antisocial traits, volitional non-cooperation, no major psychosis. They added a point that matters in courtrooms and street corners alike. Some mental illness does not equal incompetence. The question is what the mind could do in the moment that mattered. On waiver, the panel said the right to be present is real, but it can be waived, and this record showed the judge made sure Mason knew the stakes. Judge Corman went to the holding cell, spelled out everything to him. The judge had even said Mason was entitled to the opportunity to participate. Mason chose the cell anyway. That made the absence voluntary and knowing. On finishing the trial without him, the panel quoted the old logic: a defendant doesn't get to break up a trial at will. The public interest in proceeding, the assembled jury and witnesses, and the risk of gamesmanship outweighed any stall. In short, the show went on because the court couldn't let one defendant hold the whole system hostage. Once the ink dried, the narrative hardened into lines that still sting. Not long after, word spread that Pappy put a contract on Caldwell. She brushed it off in public, but colleagues said the threat was for real. Everyone in that building knew another federal prosecutor had once opened a booby-trapped briefcase with a gun inside. The work stayed dangerous. Caldwell kept moving. In 1994, she got the Department of Justice's highest trial award. She then built the Violent Criminal Enterprises section and led it for years. All the while, the shadow of the wider operation stayed in view. Lorenzo Fat Cat Nichols was born December 25, 1958, in Birmingham, Alabama. Raised first by his grandmother, then moved to Queens around age 10 to live with his mother Louisa and her third husband. He dropped out before 9th grade, fell in with the Seven Crowns, and by 1976 he was catching heavy heat for 2 stick-ups that brought an 18-year sentence. He walked in 1980 after about 2.5 years, and the street saw a quick pivot from robbery to the bigger bag. Out the gate, Nichols slid into the dope game with the mafia lane, because at that time, the mob held most East Coast supply. He played wholesale like a boss, setting up a network that fed Southeast Queens projects and middlemen across the area. Nichols and Pappy Mason made a dangerous pair. When the crack era burned hottest, their names sat on top of the Queens pyramid. When things went wrong, bodies proved points. If you want to understand Pappy's reign, you have to understand the throne next to his fat cat trusted Pappy. He surrounded himself with loyal names. People called him the crazy guy that crazy guys feared. When he spoke, the street moved. Pappy's rise stays tied to Fat Cat's name. The power didn't just bring profit, it brought pressure. And when witnesses and police pushed back, the crew showed how far it would go to keep the hustle safe. His circle also included Luke Spoon Steven and Joseph Mike Bones Rogers. Each name had a job. Some handled the stash, some moved weight, some enforced. Nichols got the Fat Cat tag from his look, a linebacker thick neck, a big head that crowded photos, and a rangy beard. The name felt made for a boss. On the street, image matters. Your look walks into the room before your words do. With a nickname that heavy, every order hit harder, every warning stuck longer. That branding helped sell control. It told rivals and workers the same thing. The boss is larger than life, and he's watching. Nichols kept his people close and his power closer. This wasn't random hustle. It was structure, discipline, and fear working together. The deli acted like a clubhouse and a command post. Orders slid across tables, not paper. Phones rang with coded talk. Runners came and went. That room kept the whole engine humming. When beef flared on a block, it got discussed here. When a worker got sloppy, the fix started here. Nichols inherited the spot from his then father-in-law, and he turned it into a nerve center. If you wanted to feel the pulse of his empire, you stood on that tile. On July 29, 1985, cops raided and found 2 guns under him, plus cash around $180,000 and stashes of heroin, cocaine, coke, weed, and marijuana. They also found Fat Cat at a desk marked World's Greatest Daddy, sitting surrounded by a Steyr semi-auto. He posted bail, $70,000, then walked into Brian Rooney's office and tried to pass it off as a sandwich stop. Rooney checked with the raid team, snapped, cuffed him for parole violation, and got him remanded without bail. 2 months later, Rooney was lured into his Dodge Dart and shot dead on 119th Avenue. Perry Bellamy said on tape that Pappy and Chris Jughead Williams were in the Datsun, and that Pappy pulled the trigger. Pappy beat that case in 1987 with a hung jury, but cops found a Derringer in his boot, and he caught a gun conviction off that. Even locked, Fat Cat kept the phones hot and the corners tight, pushing orders from behind bars and punishing anyone who crossed the set. With money and control came hard choices. In 1986, after a home invasion on his then girlfriend Carolyn Tyson, Nichols' people hunted down Isaac Bolden, a childhood friend tied to that robbery, and shot him dead. The cold didn't stop there. In December 1987, Myrtle Maisha Horsham, the mother of his son TC, got hit after skimming money from the operation. She was shot multiple times in a car with a friend who survived, while the child was later dropped at his grandmother's yard. On the streets, that read like policy: steal from the enterprise, pay in blood. Nichols later admitted he ordered the killings. In a sealed courtroom, the judge asked him straight if one purpose was to teach the organization a lesson about not stealing. Nichols answered, "It wasn't just the stealing, it was the fact that she was my girl and that she took my money and spent it on another person. She made me look bad in front of people who was within the organization. That's the code, respect over everything." That answer is a blueprint for gang discipline. This wasn't romance, this was optics. A leader in that game cannot look weak. To protect status, he sent a fatal message to his own people. That's how you know fear, not love, held this empire together. The empire's shine drew smoke back. In 1987, men with fake badges kidnapped Nichols' wife and held her for ransom. She was freed after a cash drop, and the crew who grabbed her got caught. A year later, May 1988, his mother's house in South Jamaica got firebombed. Louisa and her husband escaped, but Nichols' invalid half-sister Mary died in the blaze. That hit showed the cost of running a heavy set. In the crack era, the Horsham murder ripped his own house. Nichols' mother, Louise Coleman, disowned him. That says what this world costs. Street loyalty can demand things that family cannot accept. A boss can hold a whole neighborhood in fear and still lose the one person whose word once shaped him. In that moment, you see the split. Love on one side of the glass, power on the other, and no bridge left. December 4th, 1987, Maurice Bellamy, father of the man who had tried to link Fat Cat to Rooney, was shot in a laundromat. Glaze told a jury he did it on behalf of Nichols. Nichols denied giving that order. By 1989, Nichols signed a cooperation deal and slid into witness custody under an alias. From witness custody, Nichols talked soft over the phone, more Alabama than monster, but cops and DAs called him the kind who could say kill him in a quiet tone and leave bodies stacked like cordwood. He told childhood stories, and how he learned to keep a throne from behind bars. Nichols pleaded guilty to ordering the murder of his parole officer, Brian Rooney. The sentence hit hard, 25 years to life. He also pleaded to drug and racketeering charges and picked up another 40 years. The motive line people remember is simple. He felt disrespected and wanted to make a point. In that world, disrespect isn't a word, it's a trigger. When a parole officer puts hands on the kingpin through the system, the kingpin sometimes sends hands back through the street. Those convictions stacked years like bricks. The state time stood next to the federal time. He had already been in custody before the federal sentencing, but the clock didn't count that time the way he expected. That detail would matter later. For the moment, the message was clear. In 2010, the Daily News ran a letter Nichols wrote from prison. He said, "I have nothing but time to ponder my misdeeds," and offered my deepest regret and sincerest apology to his victims. That's the sound of a man watching his life replay on a loop. Regret doesn't rewind bodies, but it tells you the silence of a cell can get louder than the noise of a corner, and some bosses finally hear what they did. In April 2022, the state parole board granted Nichols parole from state prison. Paper moved, doors opened, and he left Clinton Correctional Facility and went straight into federal custody. It was movement, not freedom. The Bureau of Prisons still had a hold on him. The path now ran through federal time and paperwork that had its own rules and math. Outside voices argued, but the calendar kept flipping just the same. February 2023 brought a new turn. Judge Edward Corman cut 3 years off Nichols' federal time. The judge said the Bureau of Prisons hadn't given credit for the 4 years Nichols spent in federal custody before his 1992 sentence. He wrote that if he could redo it, he would have given 36 years instead of 40 to account for that time. The First Step Act gave him the discretion to fix it now. This ruling wasn't about a clean bill of health or mercy alone. It was the math of custody credit meeting the law's new tools. In that push for release, Nichols said he had health problems and stress from COVID lockdowns. He said he lost family to the pandemic, including a niece and a newborn grandson. He talked about anxiety and migraines inside Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center. That's the human side of the cage. Sick call, quarantine, and news you can't touch. Whether the judge weighed that or not, those words show how even a kingpin breaks down under time and loss. Even with the federal reduction, Nichols still had a Florida case waiting. In 2007, he got 10 years there, consecutive to his other time. The plan was to move him to Florida custody. His lawyer hinted they might challenge that case because father and son had the same attorney while the son cooperated. But for now, the route stayed set. Out of federal, into another set of bars, a different DEOC number, and more years to count. Not everyone saw a technical fix. The judge explained arithmetic, but the city doesn't hear arithmetic without emotion. The NYC Police Benevolent Association blasted the ruling. "Not even a millisecond should have been shaved off this murderous drug lord's sentence," said Patrick Lynch. He talked about Eddie Byrne and Brian Rooney not coming home. He said this cop killer must not be sent home ever. Outrage outside the courtroom reminds you that law is paper, but pain is bone deep. Families and unions don't hear credit time. They hear the shots again. Headlines called him a notorious Queens drug kingpin, getting sprung 3 years early. Reports said he was linked, but never charged, to Officer Byrne's murder. They underlined that he pleaded to ordering Rooney's killing and 2 others, including his ex-girlfriend. The articles quoted the judge's math about credit time and the First Step Act. They quoted defense filings that pitched Nichols as rehabilitated, a motivating force who wanted to repair damage. They quoted his own letter. "There is nothing smart or glorious about being a drug dealer." That letter to the parole board said, "I now realize how young and ignorant I was. I take full accountability for my actions that left a trail of destruction and tore many families apart." It's the kind of statement people expect when a parole door is nearby. Some hear growth, some hear strategy. The court's move, though, wasn't about that growth. It was about how time should have been counted back then, and how the First Step Act lets a judge adjust now. Even with apologies on paper, the old image wouldn't fade. People still saw Fat Cat as the boss who ordered hits and made examples. That memory also kept linking his name to Eddie Byrne, even though he was never charged in that killing. In the neighborhoods, rumor and truth lived side by side forever. That belief hung over him like a storm cloud. Records said Fat Cat was convicted for a car theft and title fraud ring. That time runs after his other time. For the moment, the story was simple. Nichols would not walk free. He would shift prisons, change uniforms, and wait for another judge, another clock, another door. A clean way to see his path is by counting. A Florida 10-year bid waiting on deck. Every number is a choice. Every number is a reminder of a boss who measured respect in fear. Rooney's partner said it plain. Brian got a life sentence of death and nothing brings him back. That line hits harder than any legal memo. It tells you why these cases still light up the city. It tells you what victims carry when a judge cites math from decades ago. As Nichols waited for transfer, voices on both sides kept talking. Defense said he was rehabilitated and ready to repair damage. Prosecutors called him a kingpin who commissioned murders. But the blueprint Fat Cat wrote still gets studied by kids who think a nickname can make them bulletproof. His life journey. That contrast teaches harder than any sermon. Fat Cat was a brand, a mask, and a threat. It worked on corners and in back rooms. It kept rivals in line. The look that once filled photos now stares out from doc databases. Fat Cat's machine made space for Pappy Mason to rise and rule with his own crew, the Bebos. Fat Cat's headquarters, his orders, and his code formed the backdrop for Pappy's hardest move. When asked what the burn hit did to him, Fat Cat said, "I feel like what Pappy did, he destroyed everybody. He destroyed my whole family." Fat Cat, careful with his words, called the slaying the stupidest shit in the whole world and said of Pappy, things you could solve with your mind he'd rather solve with a pistol. By then, the cat had turned canary, waiting on whether the government would ask for mercy on his life case, hoping to die with his feet on the sidewalk and not in a cell. Out on the block, the deli's back office became a crime scene in memory. The Bebo's name turned into a warning, and the corner where a rookie sat alone stayed the loudest line in a war that tried to make fear the rule and found the law ready to answer in kind. Decades later, the Pappy Mason case still moves like a shadow, and by 2024, the fight is sitting on the parole calendar instead of the corner. Cops said Todd Scott played the decoy at that window, drawing Edward Burns' attention just before 5 shots tore through the driver's side on February 26, 1988. Scott caught 25 to life and has been locked in Shawangunk. Eligible since 2013, he faced the board again on January 23, 2024. The answer landed on February 12, denied. The union called it relief, and the city marked another year at that same intersection with a solemn roll call. Scott's next shot is August 2025, but the street memory he's tied to has a long reach. From the start, this hit was theater for the whole city. A rookie in a marked unit, posted alone to guard a witness who dared to call out the trade. They tried to make an example of Eddie, sending a message to the police and the public that they ruled the streets, said Kenneth Byrne. That line still hangs over every parole packet tied to this case. It is why the board reads the file like a murder scene, not a math problem. Prosecutors say David McClary was the trigger man who put 5 to Byrne's head. McClary argued he served 12 years more than the minimum, finished programs, and kept clean. In April 2025, Brooklyn's top fed, U.S. Attorney John Durham, wrote the board and called McClary's crime the worst of the worst. He said the reasons offered for release were self-serving and hollow. He said the killing was payback because Mason felt dissed after the gun bust. The letter was a reminder. This wasn't panic, it was premeditated, and the motive was gang pride dressed up as revenge. Durham said that good behavior and being clean is expected of every inmate and cannot outweigh the choice to kill a cop guarding a firebombed witness home. He said McClary has never demonstrated any genuine remorse, and that the impact will continue to reverberate well beyond the years served. By August 2025, the board denied McClary again after his July 22nd appearance. State records show he stayed in Wendy, with another shot at the board next year. The Byrne family kept showing up and speaking out. He should stay in prison because he's not fit or capable, nor does he deserve the right to go back on the street, said Kenneth Byrne. The family also talked about the chaplain at their door, about parents collapsing, about time aging them faster than years should. Every hearing drags that night back into the room. 2 more names ride this file. Philip Copeland is set for the board in November. Scott Cobb, the driver that night, was paroled in 2023. The union says it will keep opposing releases for the remaining men. Each move on the calendar hits the Byrne family like a fresh knock. Every 2 years, we have to go back and do this again, Kenneth said, pointing to how the process loops while the loss never changes. The Police Benevolent Association keeps the pressure high in public. Patrick Hendry told New Yorkers to keep sending the same message to the board. If you murder a cop, you live out your days in a cell. We need New Yorkers to keep sending a message to the parole board, he wrote. That's the counter message to the one the crew tried to blast in 1988. One side used a .38 on a rookie. The other side uses policy, statements, and turnout at every hearing. Year after year, the details return like markers on a map. Kenneth Byrne called the stance simple. The best way to honor Eddie is to show there is no redemption for those who kill police officers. He said it was very comforting to know that message wasn't reinforced this time around when Scott's parole was denied. The family also carries the weight of changes in the board's approach since 2017, watching dozens of cop killers walk in other cases, embracing every cycle for the next decision. McClary's denial in 2025 does not end the story. He will be back before the board next year. Todd Scott is scheduled again for August 2025. Copeland lines up for November. Each hearing reopens the file, replays the route to that corner, and resets the fight over what time means when a murder was meant to shake a city. And behind it all sits the order that set the night in motion, the word from Pappy Mason that put a price on a uniform. The lights fade, but the echo stays. A rookie's badge, a quiet corner, a name that made whole blocks hold their breath. We watched how a prison order slid through phones and loyalties, how a crew turned a symbol into a target, and how a city answered with tape, testimony, and time. No myths here, just a cold grind of rank and rules, a code that measured respect in silence, and a verdict that told every set the system could still swing back. Families kept chairs empty. Cops kept watch at the same intersection every year, and the streets kept telling the story because the story still tells the streets. This is what power looks like when fear is the currency. This is how branding works when the product is violence. This is what happens when a message is meant for every patrol room and every window with the curtains half closed. Now we're only left with questions. What protects a neighborhood? Fear on the corner or truth on the stand? When a crew chooses a symbol instead of a face, are they sending power or admitting weakness? If one order from a cell can freeze a block, can one verdict thaw it for good? And lastly, when the next set decides a message must be sent, who gets to write the last line? The street, the badge, or the jury? Let us know what you think in the comments box below. And if you liked how we presented you this video, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe for more.